Who Rang the Dinner Bell Early? A Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Wrong Note. The scream came in the middle of the descent, which was, as Miss Marple observed afterward, rather a shame, because Prudence Hale had been playing it beautifully. It was Mrs. Ottoline Grieve who screamed, and she screamed not because she had seen anything dreadful, not yet, but because Mr. Wilfrid Coombs, choir master of St. Fride's, had risen halfway from his chair at the harmonium's third bar, clutched at the collar of his cassock as though it had suddenly grown too tight, and folded sideways into the choir stalls like a marionette whose strings had been cut all at once. The church was cold. It was always cold in October, when the fog came up off the water meadows and sat along the lanes of Nettlecombe Parva like something that had decided to stay the winter. But nobody remembered the cold afterward. What they remembered was the silence that fell when Prudence Hale's hands came off the keys, and the tenors stopped mid-phrase, and 11-year-old Tilly Marsh, who had been singing the solo line, simply stood there in her white surplice, with her mouth still open. "Get Dr. Ashworth," said the vicar, the Reverend Aubrey Pendle, in a voice that did not sound like his own. He was already on his knees beside the choir master, one hand at the man's throat. Nobody needed telling twice. Colonel Rafe Bunting, who had been sitting in the third pew waiting to walk his wife home, was out of the door and down the path before the vicar had finished speaking. Dr. Miles Ashworth's cottage was only 4 minutes distant. If a man ran, and Colonel Bunting ran, it made no difference. By the time the doctor arrived, breathless, his bag banging against his knee, Wilfrid Coombs was beyond any help that Nettlecombe Parva or anywhere else could offer him. "Heart," said Dr. Ashworth, after a moment's examination, though his voice had the particular flatness of a man saying something he does not quite believe, must have been his heart. It was left to Miss Jane Marple, who had been sitting at the very back of the church, ostensibly to avoid the draught from the north door, but in fact because it gave her an excellent view of the choir stalls, to notice the one small, ordinary thing that nobody else thought worth noticing at all. Mr. Coombs's spectacles were not on his face. They were not on the floor beside him either. He had worn them, without exception, every Thursday evening for the 11 years Miss Marple had lived in the village, because without them he could not read the hymn sheets, and a choir master who cannot read his hymn sheets is a choir master who makes a great many wrong notes. He had been wearing them not 10 minutes before, when he had corrected young Dennis Farrow's phrasing in the second verse of "The Day Thou Gavest." She said nothing. It was not yet the moment for saying things. But she folded her gloved hands in her lap and thought, with the particular gentle attentiveness she brought to a piece of knitting that had gone slightly wrong 4 rows back, that something in the pattern here did not match. Chapter 2. The Village Draws Its Conclusions. By 9 the next morning, Nettlecombe Parva had already settled the matter to its own satisfaction 3 separate times, and each time differently. At the post office, Mrs. Ivy Latchford, who ran it with the brisk proprietary air of a woman who considered village correspondence to be, in some sense, her own business, informed every customer that it was plainly his heart, poor man, and hadn't she said only last month that he looked peaky, working himself to death over that wretched harvest cantata? At the Bell and Plough, the opinion ran rather differently. Old Amos Price, who had dug graves in the churchyard for 30 years and considered himself an authority on death in all its forms, muttered into his beer that a man didn't go blue about the lips from a bad heart, not like that, not sudden as a snuffed candle. He had seen his share of heart attacks. This wasn't one. And at the vicarage, the Reverend Pendle sat with his head in his hands and told his wife that he did not know what he believed, except that he had never in his life seen a man look so surprised to be dying. Dr. Ashworth, for his part, had not signed the death certificate. He had sent, instead, a very careful and very worried letter to the county coroner, and by Friday afternoon a police surgeon from the county town had come out on the bus, taken samples, and gone away again without saying very much to anyone. Miss Marple heard all 3 versions before lunch. delivered to her doorstep in succession by Mrs. Latchford, Hart, by the woman who did for her, Mrs. Hartnell's niece, a fit, possibly brought on by the excitement of the cantata, and by the vicar himself, who called on her not for gossip, but, she rather suspected, because he did not know what else to do with his unease, and trusted that she, of all the village, would not tell him he was imagining things. "He was perfectly well at tea," the vicar said, turning his hat round and round in his hands. "Perfectly well. He had 2 cups and a slice of the seed cake my wife made, and he was laughing about something with Miss Hale at the harmonium. I don't know what, some joke about the descant, and then not 2 hours later he stopped." "Where did he take his tea, Vicar?" Miss Marple asked, pouring him a second cup of her own, which he did not touch. "In the vestry, before choir practice. He always did, on Thursdays. Miss Hale generally brought a flask for the 2 of them, since it saves lighting the vestry stove twice." "How very thoughtful of her," said Miss Marple, and something in the mildness of her tone made the vicar glance up, though he could not have said afterward what had struck him about it. Chapter 3. 8 People and a Flask. The inquest, when it came, was a brief and unsatisfying affair, adjourned almost as soon as it opened, for the analyst's report was not yet ready. But Inspector Neal, sent down from the county, a lean, watchful man with the manner of someone permanently unsurprised by human folly, did not wait for the coroner before beginning his own inquiries, and it was he who first said the word aloud, in the vestry, to the vicar and to Dr. Ashworth, in a voice pitched low enough that it did not carry beyond the door where Miss Marple happened, quite by chance, to be arranging the flowers. "Poison," said Inspector Neal. "Digitalis, the surgeon thinks, though we'll know for certain in a few days. Enough to stop a heart that had no earthly reason to stop on its own." Miss Marple, who had excellent hearing when it suited her, continued to arrange the Michaelmas daisies with every appearance of complete absorption. It transpired that 8 people had been in and around the vestry and the choir stalls in the hour before Mr. Coombs died, any one of whom might, in the ordinary confusion of arriving, hanging up coats, finding hymn sheets, and gossiping in low voices before the vicar called them to order, have had a moment alone with the choir master's tea, or with the small brown bottle of throat lozenges he kept in his cassock pocket and was in the habit of sucking 2 or 3 of during a long rehearsal. There was Miss Prudence Hale, the organist, a quiet woman of perhaps 50 who had come to Nettlecombe Parva some 15 years before to keep house for an aunt, long since dead, and had simply stayed on, teaching piano to the vicarage children and playing the organ every Sunday and Thursday, with a competence nobody troubled to praise because it had become, over the years, entirely unremarkable, which was, Miss Marple thought privately, rather a curious thing for a woman's whole personality to become. There was Mrs. Ottoline Grieve, chairwoman of the Garden Society, a big handsome woman with a carrying voice and a passion for dahlias, who had quarrelled with Mr. Coombs only the week before over the choir's use of the church hall for cantata rehearsals, cutting into her precious Wednesday flower arranging sessions. There was Colonel Rafe Bunting, retired, who sang bass rather badly, and had done so for 20 years with a persistence nobody had the heart to discourage, and whose wife had once let slip, at a whist drive, that the Colonel had settled something with Mr. Coombs the previous spring, a remark she had seemed instantly to regret. There was Dr. Miles Ashworth himself, the locum who had come to cover for old Dr. Grantley's retirement 18 months before, and had never quite left, tenor in the choir, unmarried, pleasant, and, as Miss Marple had noticed on more than one occasion, a man who knew a very great deal more about the correct dosage of digitalis than most. There was young Dennis Farrow, lately back from his national service, restless in the way of young men who have seen a wider world and found the village smaller for it, who sang tenor beside the doctor, and had, more than once, been heard to say that Coombs ran the choir like a regimental sergeant major, and somebody ought to tell him so. There was Mrs. Ivy Latchford, the postmistress, who did not sing but came every Thursday to collect the hymn sheets for the following Sunday's printing, and who had, everyone agreed, No earthly reason to wish Mr. Coombs anything but good health, since he was one of her better customers for stamps and gramophone record parcels. There was little Tilly Marsh, 11 years old, whose solo it had been, and who could surely be set aside from any list of suspects on grounds of both age and evident grief. Though Miss Marple, watching the child across the churchyard the day after the funeral, thought there was something in the set of her shoulders that was not quite grief, or not only grief, and there was, of course, the vicar himself, though nobody, least of all Inspector Neale, seriously entertained the notion that the Reverend Aubrey Pendle had poisoned his own choirmaster over a disagreement about hymn numbers. 8 people, said Inspector Neale to Dr. Ashworth, closing his notebook, and not one of them with a motive I can see that would justify killing a mild little man who ran the church choir. Not one that you can see, said Miss Marple to herself, quite privately, arranging the last of the daisies. But then, Inspector, you have not lived here for 11 years. Chapter 4. What Miss Marple Remembered. It was a curious fact about Miss Marple, one that had baffled a succession of policemen over a great many years, that she rarely appeared to be investigating anything at all. She called on the vicar's wife about the church flower rota. She took tea with Mrs. Latchford at the post office and discussed, at some length, the difficulty of obtaining good wool for winter cardigans. She stopped Colonel Bunting in the lane to admire his dahlias, though privately she thought Mrs. Greaves a good deal finer, and said so, which produced a most interesting flicker of irritation across the Colonel's weathered face. And in the evenings, in her own small sitting-room, with the fire lit against the October damp, she thought about the spectacles that had not been on Mr. Coombs's face, and were not on the floor, and had not, according to Inspector Neale's very thorough search, been found anywhere in the church at all, not in his cassock pocket, not on the harmonium, not in the vestry among his other effects. A man who could not read hymn sheets without his spectacles did not, as a rule, mislay them in the 10 minutes between correcting Dennis Farrow's phrasing and falling dead in the choir stalls. Someone had taken them, and a person does not take a dead man's spectacles unless there is something written somewhere, a note, a letter, a name in a ledger, that those spectacles were needed to read, and that it was better nobody else read it either. She thought, too, about the flask of tea, which Miss Hale had brought as she always did on Thursdays, and which had, according to the surgeon's preliminary findings, contained no trace of digitalis at all, a fact Inspector Neale found reassuring, and Miss Marple found, if anything, rather more suggestive than if it had, for if the poison had not been in the tea, which any of the 8 might plausibly have touched, then it had very likely been in the lozenges, which only Mr. Coombs himself, in the ordinary way of things, would take, which meant the poisoner had either tampered with the bottle at some earlier point in the day, when it sat, as it generally did, in the vestry cupboard where the choir hung their coats, or had handed him something directly, something he would take without a second thought, from a person he trusted absolutely. And there was a third thing, smaller still, which Miss Marple turned over in her mind with the particular care she gave to a stitch that did not look quite right. Mrs. Otterline Grieve, in describing the scene to anyone who would listen, had mentioned, quite in passing, quite without seeming to attach any importance to it, that Mr. Coombs had seemed, in the last week of his life, unusually cheerful, almost, she said, like a man who had come into money, or settled some old score, or finally got the better of somebody who had been getting the better of him for years. Now that, said Miss Marple aloud, to the empty room and the small fire, is a very interesting thing for a man to be, the week before he is murdered. She thought, finally, of young Tilly Marsh, standing very still in the churchyard with her shoulders set in a manner that was not quite grief, and of the fact that children in small villages see and hear a very great deal that grown people, absorbed in their own concerns, entirely fail to notice they are seeing and hearing at all. It was not yet enough, but it was, Miss Marple felt, very much the beginning of a pattern, and patterns, in her long experience of both knitting and murder, had a way of resolving themselves quite clearly once one had identified which threads did not belong. Chapter 5. A Conversation at the Post Office. "Of course," said Mrs. Ivy Latchford, weighing out a parcel of gramophone records with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had run the Nettlecombe Parva post office for 11 years and considered its counter a species of confessional. "I always did think there was something not quite right about Miss Hale." Miss Marple, who had come in on the pretext of a book of stamps, made a small sound of polite encouragement. 15 years she's been here," Mrs. Latchford went on, "and what do we really know about her? Came to keep house for old Miss Effingham, who was some sort of connection on her mother's side, though I never could work out quite what, and when Miss Effingham died, well, she just stayed. Never talks about where she was before, never talks about family. I did ask her once, quite friendly, whether she had any people of her own, and she went quite pale and changed the subject to the weather." She lowered her voice. "And there was a letter, Miss Marple, a few months back, redirected from some solicitor's office in Bristol, and when I handed it to her across this very counter, her hand shook, so I thought she'd drop it." "How very curious," said Miss Marple, who found this a good deal less curious than Mrs. Latchford supposed, since solicitors' letters arrive for the most ordinary reasons imaginable: a small legacy, a query about a boundary, the settling of some minor estate, and hands shake for reasons that have nothing whatever to do with guilt. But she filed the fact away nonetheless, in the manner of a careful gardener who does not yet know whether a given seedling is a flower or a weed, and waits to see what it becomes before pulling it up. "And Mr. Coombs knew something about her," Mrs. Latchford said, with the satisfied air of a woman arriving at her real point at last. "I'd stake my life on it. There was an afternoon, back in the summer, before all this dreadful business, when I saw the two of them talking outside the vestry, and Miss Hale was crying, Miss Marple actually crying, and Mr. Coombs had hold of her arm, not unkindly, you understand, but firm, like a man telling somebody something they didn't want to hear. Did you hear what was said? Not a word, but I know I'm upset when I see it. And Prudence Hale was upset that afternoon in a way I've never seen her upset before or since. And then not 2 months later he's dead, and it's her tea flask sitting right there next to him not an hour before." Miss Marple bought her book of stamps and thanked Mrs. Latchford very warmly for the gramophone records, which were in fact nothing to do with her at all, but had belonged to the parcel of the woman queuing behind her, and walked home through the thinning autumn fog, turning the conversation over and over, the way she might turn over a length of wool to see whether the pattern held true on both sides. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of story the village would construct: obvious, dramatic, and almost certainly wrong in its particulars, even where it was right in its instinct. Miss Hale was upset. Miss Hale did have some secret in her past that a solicitor's letter had stirred. Mr. Coombs probably had known something about her that she did not wish to know, but an organist who has kept a secret quietly for 15 years does not, as a rule, choose to commit murder in a church full of witnesses on the one evening when discovery is most certain, when a quieter and more private opportunity might so easily have been arranged. It was, Miss Marple felt, altogether too neat a solution, the sort of solution that fits together so easily precisely because the village had been assembling it, piece by piece, out of nothing but its own appetite for a story with a villain already cast. She thought, instead of the missing spectacles and the flask that had not been poisoned, and a choirmaster who had seemed, in his last week, remarkably and specifically pleased with himself, and she thought, with rather more attention than she had given it before, of Tilly Marsh's shoulders in the churchyard. Chapter 6. The Child Who Saw Something. It was not difficult to arrange a conversation with Tilly Marsh. Miss Marple had only to mention, to the child's mother, that she was rather behind with a piece of knitting meant to be a Christmas gift, and that Tilly, who was a clever girl with her hands, might be persuaded to help with a simple border while her mother finished the washing, an arrangement that produced within the hour a solemn 11-year-old sitting very upright on Miss Marple's second-best chair with a ball of grey wool in her lap and an expression of a child who has been told, quite clearly, to say nothing to anybody about anything at all. They knitted in companionable silence for some minutes. Miss Marple did not ask a single question about Mr. Coombs. She asked about school and about Tilly's rabbit and whether she thought she might sing the solo again next Christmas, at which the child's face did something complicated and unhappy, and her needles slowed. "I don't think I want to," Tilly said at last, very low. "I don't think I want to sing in the choir at all anymore." "That would be a great pity," said Miss Marple gently, "for I'm told you have a lovely voice, but I expect it must feel very strange going back into that church after what happened." Tilly said nothing for a long moment. Then, in the particular rush of words that comes from a child who has been holding something in far too long, she said, "I saw him, Mr. Coombs, before. I saw him talking to somebody by the vestry door before we all went in for practice. And I know I oughtn't to have listened, but I did, a bit. And he said something about how it wasn't fair to keep pretending, and that people had a right to know who they really were. And the person he was talking to said, 'Please, please don't.' And then Mr. Coombs said it wasn't up to him anymore. He'd already written it down and given it to someone, and it was too late to take back." "Written what down, my dear? Did he say that?" "No, I didn't hear that bit. Mrs. Grieve came round the corner just then with the flower rota, and I had to go in and warm up my voice. Tilly's needles had stopped altogether. I didn't tell the policeman. I didn't want to get anybody in trouble, because I didn't even know who it was. It was too dark to see properly, only their voice, and I couldn't even be sure of that." "But you have some idea," said Miss Marple, very softly, "or you would not have looked so unhappy in the churchyard the day after the funeral." Tilly's eyes filled, all at once, with the particular helpless tears of a child caught between two loyalties she does not fully understand. "It sounded like a lady's voice," she whispered, "but I don't want to say who I thought it was, because I might be wrong, and if I'm wrong I'll have said a wicked thing about somebody who didn't do anything." Miss Marple did not press her. She had learned, over a very long life, that pressing a frightened child rarely produces truth. Only whatever answer will make the pressing stop. Instead, she said, comfortably, that Tilly had been very brave to say as much as she had, and that some things were better told to a policeman after all, even difficult things, because the alternative, letting a wicked thing go unpunished for want of a little courage, was very much worse. But when the child had gone home, a ball of grey wool tucked under her arm, Miss Marple sat for a long while by her fire, without picking up her own knitting at all. He'd already written it down and given it to someone. Not a threat spoken aloud then, that might be denied or forgotten. A document, given to someone, a solicitor, perhaps, or a trusted friend, to be produced or acted upon, regardless of whatever happened to Wilfred Coombs himself, which meant, Miss Marple thought, with the particular chill of a person who has just understood that a puzzle is a good deal darker than she had supposed, that killing the choirmaster would very likely not have stopped the secret from coming out at all, unless the killer did not yet know that, unless the killer believed, mistakenly, that silencing the one man who knew would be enough to keep the past buried where it had lain, undisturbed, for a very long time. Chapter 7. A window left open. It was Mrs. Hartnell's niece, coming to lay the vestry fire on the Saturday morning before the second Sunday since Mr. Coombs's death, who found the small side window forced and the choirmaster's old oak cupboard, the one in which he kept his music, his spare cassock, and the tin box where he filed away odds and ends of parish business, standing open with its contents dragged out and left scattered across the vestry floor. Inspector Neal, summoned at once, found nothing missing that anyone could name with certainty. The tin box itself was there, its papers disturbed but apparently all present, old choir rosters, receipts for hymnals, a faded photograph of the 1949 harvest supper. Nothing of any obvious value had been taken. Somebody was looking for something, Neil said to Miss Marple, whom he had by now, with the particular reluctant respect a sensible policeman develops for a sensible old lady who happens to be nearly always right, began consulting rather more freely than his training strictly recommended. And whatever it wasn't money, because there were £2 in that box in loose coins, plain as day, and it's still there." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I shouldn't think it was money at all, Inspector. I think it was a piece of paper, and I think whoever searched for it did not find it, or they should not have needed to force the window a second time, for I understand from Mrs. Hartnell's niece that the cupboard lock was already broken quite some weeks ago and never mended, so that anybody wishing simply to look inside might have done so at any quiet moment without the least difficulty. It is only the window that troubles me. One does not force a window to reach a cupboard whose lock is already broken, unless one is coming at a time when the church itself is locked and must get in before searching, which means the search happened at night." "Which means," said Miss Marple, "that whoever it was could not risk being seen entering by the church door in daylight, because they are somebody whose presence in the vestry at any ordinary hour would occasion no remark whatsoever, and it was therefore not the getting into the vestry they feared being seen at, but the searching itself. A person who belongs in a place may go there at any hour without a soul thinking twice of it. It is only the manner of this visit, furtive, at night, forced, that gives it away as something other than an innocent errand." Inspector Neal frowned. "You're saying it's one of the choirs, or the vicar's household, somebody with a natural right to be in that vestry at any hour of the day." "I am saying," Miss Marple said gently, "that whoever searched that cupboard on Friday night already knew, from long acquaintance with poor Mr. Coombs and his habits, precisely where he was in the habit of keeping his private papers, and had, I think, already looked there once before, at some perfectly ordinary hour, and been disappointed. This second, more desperate search suggests to me that the paper in question has not yet been found, and that its finder is growing rather frightened." She did not add, for it was not yet the moment, and she was never one to alarm a policeman with a supposition she could not yet support, that a person frightened enough to force a window in the dead of night was a person who might, before very much longer, do something a good deal more desperate still. Chapter 8. The Solicitor's Letter. It was Miss Marple's practice, when a fact would not settle comfortably into the pattern she was assembling, to set it gently aside and examine it again later, rather as one leaves a difficult stitch and returns to it with fresh eyes after a cup of tea. The matter of Miss Hale's solicitor's letter had been troubling her in precisely this fashion, and so, on the Monday, she called upon Prudence Hale directly, not by way of interrogation, which would have terrified the poor woman into silence, but by way of a perfectly genuine invitation to discuss the arrangement of hymns for the memorial service that was to be held, at the vicar's suggestion, for Mr. Coombs the following Sunday. They talked hymns for a good 20 minutes in Miss Hale's small, neat sitting-room, which was furnished with the particular bareness of a woman who has never quite believed she was entitled to put down roots. Then Miss Marple, over a second cup of Miss Hale's rather weak tea, said, with every appearance of idle sympathy, "It must have been a very trying summer for you, my dear, with all the excitement of your aunt's estate finally being settled. Solicitors take such an age about these things." Miss Hale's cup rattled faintly in its saucer. "You heard about the letter? Village post offices are not, I fear, quite as discreet as they ought to be," Miss Marple said, with a small dry smile that took the sting from the words entirely. "I understand it distressed you a good deal, at the time." There was a long pause. Then, in the manner of someone finally setting down a weight she has carried alone for too long, Prudence Hale said, "It wasn't my aunt's estate at all. That was what I told Mrs. Latchford, because it was easier than the truth. It was about my sister." "Your sister? I've never spoken of her to anyone here. We quarrelled 30 years ago, over, it doesn't matter now what over. She went to Canada. I never heard from her again, not one word in 30 years, and I told myself I didn't care." Miss Hale's hands twisted in her lap. "The solicitor's letter was to tell me she'd died, out there, alone, with nothing, and nobody to leave anything to but a sister she hadn't spoken to in 3 decades. There was a little money, not much, but it meant she'd kept me down as her next of kin, all those years, even after everything. She never took my name out of it. Her eyes filled, and Miss Marple, who had not for one moment supposed the letter had anything whatsoever to do with murder, found herself moved by a grief that was real, private, and entirely unconnected to the death of Wilfred Coombs. "And Mr. Coombs," Miss Marple said gently, after a decent interval, "did he know of this?" "I told him yes. The week the letter came. I was upset. I couldn't hide it from him. We worked so close together, Thursday after Thursday, and he was kind about it. He was a kind man, whatever else people are saying now." Miss Hale looked up, and there was real distress in her face. "I know what they think in the village, that I was crying because he had some hold over me, some secret. But it was only grief, Miss Marple. Only grief for a sister I'd wasted 30 years being too proud to write to." Miss Marple believed her entirely, and, walking home through the fog with her basket over her arm, felt the small, satisfying click of a stray thread finally accounted for and set aside. Whatever Wilfred Coombs had discovered, whatever secret had been written down and given to someone for safekeeping, it belonged to somebody else entirely. The village's tidy, appetite-driven suspicion of the sad, quiet organist had been, as she had rather suspected all along, precisely as neat and precisely as wrong as such theories generally were, which meant the lady's voice young Tilly Marsh had overheard by the vestry door, "Please, please don't," belonged to someone else, someone who had allowed the village's suspicion to settle so comfortably on poor Miss Hale, and had done nothing whatsoever to correct it. Chapter 9. What the Colonel settled Colonel Rafe Bunting was not, by temperament, a man given to confidences, and it took Miss Marple the better part of an hour, conducted, with great patience, over the excuse of admiring his dahlias one final time before the frost took them, to bring him round to the subject of what, precisely, he had settled with Wilfred Coombs the previous spring. "Damn embarrassing business," the Colonel said at last, turning quite red about his ears. "Nothing to do with any of this, mind. Nothing to do with the poor fellow's death. I'd rather it didn't get about, but I suppose if it clears my name with that inspector fellow, it had better come out." It transpired, after a good deal of throat-clearing, that the Colonel had for some years been rather less careful with the choir fund than a treasurer strictly ought to be. A small matter of some £11, borrowed against his pension one difficult winter, and never quite got round to repaying, until Coombs, going over the accounts for the harvest cantata, had noticed the shortfall and quietly said nothing to the vicar, only to the Colonel himself, and given him until Christmas to make it good. "Man was decent about it," the Colonel said gruffly. "Didn't have to be. Could have gone straight to Pendle, ruined me in the village, and he chose not to. I paid it back in June, every penny, and he tore up his own note in front of me and said we'd never speak of it again." He looked, suddenly, rather older than his years. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. Whatever else I am, I'm not an ungrateful man." Miss Marple, admiring a particularly fine bronze dahlia, believed him, and reflected, walking on, that this was now the second secret laid open before her, which, however painful to its owner, had nothing whatever to do with the death in the choir stalls. It was, she thought, rather the way of murder investigations in small villages. Everyone had something to hide, and almost none of it was the thing one was looking for. The true secret, when it finally surfaced, would very likely look, at first glance, a good deal less dramatic than half the village's private embarrassments, and would be, for that very reason, all the more easily overlooked. She thought again of the missing spectacles, of a document written down and given to someone, of Mrs. Ottoline Greaves' remark that Coombs had, in his last week, seemed like a man who had finally got the better of somebody who had been getting the better of him for years. A remark Miss Marple was beginning to suspect described Mrs. Greave rather more accurately than it described whoever Mrs. Greave had actually intended to gossip about. Chapter 10. The Garden Society Chairwoman. It was not difficult to arrange to encounter Mrs. Ottoline Greave, for that lady was rarely to be found anywhere but in her garden, tending the dahlias upon which the reputation of the Nettlecombe Parva Garden Society so largely rested, and Miss Marple, armed with a genuine question about the propagation of a particular salmon pink variety, presented herself at the Grieve Garden Gate on the Wednesday afternoon, with every appearance of innocent horticultural curiosity. Mrs. Grieve was a big, handsome woman of perhaps 55, with a carrying voice, strong forearms, and the settled confidence of a woman who has occupied the same commanding social position for so long that she has forgotten it was ever anything other than her birthright. She talked dahlias for 20 minutes with real and evident pleasure, and it was only as Miss Marple was preparing to take her leave that she introduced, with the greatest apparent casualness, the subject of poor Mr. Coombs. "Such a shock for us all," Mrs. Grieve said, snapping off a faded bloom with rather more force than the task required. "Though I own I never found him quite the paragon everybody's making him out to be, since his death. A meddlesome little man, if you want my honest opinion, always poking his nose into other people's business and calling it pastoral concern." "Had he been poking into yours, Mrs. Grieve?" The question was asked with such perfect, mild innocence that it was a moment before Mrs. Grieve's hands, busy among the dahlias, went suddenly and unmistakably still. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she said, and her carrying voice had dropped, for the first time in the conversation, to something considerably quieter. "Only that you mentioned to several people, I understand, that he had seemed unusually pleased with himself in his last week, like a man who had got the better of somebody at last. I wondered whether you happened to know who that somebody might have been." Miss Marple smiled, entirely without malice, the smile of a very old lady discussing the weather. "It struck me as such a particular thing to say, unless one had some notion of the answer already." Mrs. Otterline Grieve looked at her for a long moment across the ranked and glorious dahlias, and something moved behind her eyes that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but had elements of both. "I'm sure I couldn't say," she said at last, and turned back to her flowers with a briskness that closed the subject as firmly as a slammed door. "Wilfred Coombs is dead, Miss Marple, and I for one think it's a poor sort of Christian charity to go picking over what he thought and felt in his last days, as though we'd any right to know his private business." It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking home in the fading afternoon light, a remarkably interesting thing for a woman to say, for nobody who genuinely knew nothing of a dead man's private business was generally troubled to invoke Christian charity in order to avoid discussing it. Guilt and grief could both produce such a reaction, so, on occasion, could simply irritate a nosy old woman asking impertinent questions. But taken together with the shaking hands among the dahlias and the quiet dropped voice, and Tilly Marsh's overheard "please, please don't" in a lady's voice by the vestry door, it was a thread that would bear a good deal more pulling. Chapter 11. The Second Shock. The letter arrived at the vicarage on the Friday morning, addressed in a careful, old-fashioned hand to the Reverend Aubrey Pendle, or whoever presently has charge of the affairs of the late Mr. Wilfred Coombs, and it came, as the postmark showed, from a solicitor's office in the cathedral town some 30 miles distant, a Mr. Josiah Fenwick of Fenwick and Hale. The vicar read it twice, standing in his own hallway with his coat still on, before he sat down rather suddenly on the hall chair and asked his wife to fetch him a glass of water. It explained, in the dry, careful language of the law, that the late Mr. Coombs had, some 6 weeks previously, deposited with Mr. Fenwick's firm a sealed document, to be opened and its contents acted upon only in the event of his death, and that Mr. Fenwick, having now learned through the county newspapers of the sad and sudden circumstances of that death, felt it his professional duty to inform the appropriate parish authority that the document existed, and to inquire whether the police investigating the matter should not, in the circumstances, be given access to its contents. By that evening, Inspector Neal had the document itself, driven down specially by a clerk from Mr. Fenwick's office, and read it through twice in the vestry with the vicar and Miss Marple, for the inspector had by now given up any pretence that Miss Marple's presence at such moments was an intrusion rather than, as he privately admitted, rather a help. It was not, in the end, a very long document, but what it contained struck the small room into a silence considerably deeper than the one that had followed Mrs. Greaves' scream a fortnight before. Wilfred Coombs had written, in his own careful hand, that some 26 years earlier, while serving as organist and choirmaster at a parish in the Midlands town of Ashby-Loxton, he had come to know a young unmarried woman named Ottoline Pruitt, who had, in the autumn of that year, given birth to a daughter in circumstances of great secrecy and considerable shame, the child's father being a married man of the parish who had refused all responsibility. The infant had been given, within days of her birth, into the care of a childless couple some counties distant, under an arrangement Coombs himself, then a much younger man newly ordained into minor church duties, had helped to quietly arrange, at Miss Pruitt's own desperate and tearful request, a kindness, as he had believed it at the time, that had allowed a frightened girl to begin her life again, unburdened by scandal. Ottoline Pruitt had, within 2 years, married a Mr. Henry Grieve of Nettlecombe Parva, and had told him, and had told the entire village that had known her ever since as his wife, that she was the only daughter of a respectable family in the north, both her parents long deceased, with no other relations living. Her whole standing in the parish, her chairmanship of the Garden Society, the very name by which the village addressed her, rested upon a story that was, in every particular but her own name, entirely invented. Coombs, arriving 11 years ago to take up the post of choirmaster, had recognised her at once. A recognition, he wrote, he had kept to himself for a decade, out of what he had genuinely believed to be Christian discretion, until, this past summer, the now-grown daughter herself, a Mrs. Averil Sinclair of Toronto, had written to him, having traced through old parish records the identity of the clergyman who had arranged her adoption, asking with evident and painful longing whether he could tell her anything at all of the mother who had given her away. Coombs had gone to Mrs. Grieve directly, he wrote, not to threaten her but to plead with her, to ask her, gently, whether she might not now, so many years on, find it in her to write one letter to the daughter who only wished to know she had once been loved. Mrs. Grieve had refused absolutely, in terms he described as a distress and a fury I had not thought her capable of, and had begged him never to speak of it to a living soul, for the ruin, she said, of everything she had built. He had agreed, he wrote, to keep her secret, but he had deposited this account with his solicitor nonetheless, for I cannot in conscience let a woman go to her grave, or Mrs. Sinclair go to hers, without the truth existing somewhere, to be told if ever the moment seems right, though God knows I pray it may never need to be told at all. Inspector Neale set the document down very carefully on the vestry table. "Well," he said, into the silence, "that answers a good many questions, and raises one rather larger one, I think, Miss Marple." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, folding her hands, "for it tells us very clearly why somebody might have wished Mr. Coombs was silenced, and it tells us, I am afraid, that the silencing achieved nothing at all, since the truth has come out regardless, which means, Inspector, that whoever poisoned that poor man did so believing they were burying a secret forever, and has spent the fortnight discovering, very slowly and very dreadfully, that they killed for absolutely nothing." Chapter 12. The photograph that wasn't there. Miss Marple went, the following morning, not to Mrs. Grieve's garden, but to Dr. Ashworth's surgery, where she inquired, with the particular apologetic vagueness of an old lady worried about her own health, whether digitalis was a medicine easily come by in the village, and whether a person might, in the ordinary way of things, have some lying about the house. "More common than you'd think," Dr. Ashworth said, not in the least suspicious of the question, since half his older patients asked him something of the kind sooner or later. Foxglove derived, of course. Half the cottage gardens in England grow the plant without knowing what's in it. But as tablets prescribed, old Dr. Grantley had a fair number of heart patients on it before he retired. Henry Grieve was one, if you want a name you'd recognise. Years back now, mind. The poor fellow's been dead the better part of a decade. I shouldn't think there'd be any of his old prescription left lying about. Not after all this time. One never quite knows what stays at the back of a medicine cabinet, said Miss Marple mildly, particularly in a house where nobody has had cause to clear it out. She thanked him and went home, and sat a long while with her knitting entirely idle in her lap, assembling at last the whole shape of the pattern she had been tracing, thread by careful thread, since the evening Prudence Hale's hands had come off the harmonium keys. Mrs. Grieve had an opportunity. The flower rota gave her a perfectly ordinary reason to be in and out of the vestry at almost any hour, arousing not the smallest comment from anybody. She had the means close at hand in her own house, in a medicine cabinet nobody would think to clear out, holding tablets bought in all innocence for a husband a decade dead. She had motive of a depth and a desperation that Colonel Bunting's small dishonesty and Miss Hale's private grief could not begin to match, for what Mrs. Grieve stood to lose was not merely a little embarrassment, but every particle of the standing, the respect, and the settled identity she had spent 26 years constructing upon a lie, and there remained only the spectacles. Miss Marple thought of Tilly Marsh's fragment of overheard conversation. He'd already written it down and given it to someone, and understood, at last, what she believed had truly happened on the evening Wilfred Coombs died. He had not, that evening, been threatening Mrs. Grieve with fresh exposure. The document was already lodged with his solicitor, its existence settled weeks before. He had, she thought, been showing her something else entirely, something gentler, and in its way a good deal crueler to a woman desperate to keep the past buried. A photograph, newly arrived from Toronto, of the daughter Ottoline Grieve had given away 26 years before, grown now into a woman with, perhaps, some unmistakable trick of her mother's own features. A kindness, Coombs would have thought it, a chance for a hard heart to soften, one last time, before the whole sad business was ever spoken of again. Instead, Miss Marple suspected, it had been the final unbearable weight that tipped a desperate woman, already carrying poisoned lozenges in her handbag, against the chance of an opportunity, into using them that very evening, and, in the panic and confusion of his collapse, snatching back the photograph along with the spectacles case in which he had kept it tucked, lest anyone find it among his effects, and begin asking exactly the questions that were now, despite everything, being asked regardless. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, a solution she could prove from an armchair, however clearly its shape now stood before her, but she thought she knew, at last, precisely how it might be tested. Chapter 13. The Quiet Test. The occasion presented itself very naturally, in the form of a small gathering at the vicarage on the Sunday afternoon following the memorial service. Tea and sherry for those who had helped with the arrangements, the garden society among them, since Mrs. Grieve had, with what several people privately thought remarkable public spirit given the circumstances, supplied the chrysanthemums that banked the church that morning. Miss Marple arrived early, and contrived, without any appearance of contrivance at all, to be standing near Mrs. Grieve when the vicar's wife began circulating with the sherry, and Inspector Neale, invited, at Miss Marple's own quiet suggestion, on the pretext of thanking the parish for its cooperation, stood not far off, ostensibly deep in conversation with the vicar, but listening, as Miss Marple had asked him to, very carefully indeed. "Such a comfort," Miss Marple said, to nobody in particular, and to Mrs. Grieve directly, in the same breath, that poor Mr. Coombs's affairs are being so properly settled at last. Mr. Fenwick's clerk told the inspector, I believe, that there was a photograph mentioned in the solicitor's letter, a likeness of the young lady in Toronto, sent to Mr. Coombs only a few weeks before he died, though it doesn't seem to have turned up among his effects at all. Such a pity. I'm sure the poor woman would be glad to know it had been kept safe, whatever else becomes of the rest of the matter. She said it lightly, over the rim of her sherry glass, with no more apparent weight than a remark about the weather, and watched, with the particular attention she had once given to a difficult stitch, as the colour left Ottoline Grieve's face all at once, and the woman's hand, closing hard around the stem of her own glass, trembled visibly enough that a little sherry spilled over onto her glove. "I'm sure I don't know anything about any photograph," Mrs. Grieve said, and her carrying voice had gone thin and strange, quite unlike itself. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I find the room rather close." She set down her glass, rather too hard, so that it rang against the vicarage's good china, and left the gathering with a haste that several people noticed, and that not one of them, watching her go, could account for, except by supposing the poor woman still very much overset by grief for a man she had, after all, worked alongside on a dozen parish committees for 11 years. Miss Marple did not follow her at once. She finished her sherry, quite calmly, and exchanged a brief, private glance with Inspector Neale across the crowded room, a glance that said, as clearly as words, that the moment had come, and that what remained now was only the manner in which the truth would finally be spoken aloud. Chapter 14. Tea at the Grieve House. Miss Marple went alone, an hour later, walking through a fog that had thickened again with the falling of the afternoon, and was admitted to the Grieve House by a maid who said her mistress was resting and did not wish to be disturbed, a message Miss Marple received with perfect courtesy, and then, quite gently, disregarded, asking only that the maid announce her all the same, since she believed Mrs. Grieve would, on reflection, wish very much to see her. She was right. Ottoline Grieve received her in the small back sitting-room, sunk into a chair by an unlit fire, looking, for the first time since Miss Marple had known her, entirely without the confident carriage that had defined her in the village for a quarter of a century. She looked, instead, exactly her age, and rather more besides. "You know," she said, before Miss Marple had even taken the seat offered to her. "It was not a question." "I believe I do, my dear," said Miss Marple, settling herself with the unhurried comfort of a woman coming to an old friend's fireside, rather than a murderer's parlour, "though I should be glad to hear it from you, if you feel able to tell me. I find that things borne alone for very long are generally a great deal lighter, once they are finally set down and shared, even when the sharing itself is very hard." There was a long silence, broken only by the small sounds of the maid, unbidden, bringing in a tea tray and withdrawing again, sensing without being told that her mistress wished to be alone with her visitor. "I was 19, Ottoline Grieve said at last, pouring the tea with hands that had, by degrees, stopped shaking, as though the ordinary ritual itself steadied her. 19, and frightened out of my wits, and the man responsible wouldn't so much as acknowledge me in the street afterward. Wilfred helped me, truly helped me, whatever anybody says now, found the couple who took her, arranged it all so gently, so that I could go away afterward and begin again with nobody the wiser. I have spent 26 years being grateful to him for that kindness, Miss Marple, and 26 years being terrified of it in equal measure, because a kindness given can always, in the end, be taken back. And this summer, he asked you to write to her. He begged me to. Said she'd written to him with such longing, such gentleness, not a word of blame in it, only wanting to know she'd been loved, once, by somebody. And I couldn't, Miss Marple. Not because I didn't love her. God knows I've thought of her every single day of my life, wondered what she looked like, what she'd become, but because the moment I wrote one word to her, the moment anyone in this village learned that Ottoline Grieve, chairwoman of the Garden Society, church flower rota, 26 years a respectable widow, had borne a child out of wedlock at 19 and given her away, everything I built would be finished. Everyone who's ever admired my dahlias, everyone who's ever asked my opinion at a committee meeting, everyone who's ever treated me as somebody who mattered in this place, they'd all look at me differently forever, and I could not bear it. I have spent my whole adult life becoming somebody. I was not prepared to stop being her. And then he showed you the photograph. Ottoline Grieve's face crumpled, all at once, into something Miss Marple had genuinely not expected. Not fury, not fear, but a grief so old and so deep, it seemed to reach back the full 26 years in a single unbroken line. She has my mother's eyes, my mother, who's been dead 30 years, and there they were, looking out of a stranger's face. In a photograph a woman in Toronto had sent to a choir master in a village she's never even heard of. I looked at that photograph, Miss Marple, and I understood that I had already lost her twice, once when I gave her away, and once when I refused, all these years later, to claim her back, and I could not bear a third loss, which was the loss of everything else besides. So I did what I did, God forgive me. I did it that very evening, with the tablets I'd carried in my bag for a fortnight, not even certain I meant to use them, until I saw that photograph, and I simply couldn't think of any other way to make it stop. "The lozenge tin," Miss Marple said gently. "You had an opportunity that afternoon, before practice, when you brought the flower rota to the vestry. He'd left his cassock on the peg while he sorted hymn sheets. It took no time at all. I told myself, walking home, that I hadn't really decided anything, that I'd simply put them there in case I found the courage, and that I could still change my mind before Thursday came." She looked up, and her eyes, for the first time, held something like genuine bewilderment at her own actions. But when Thursday came, and he showed me her photograph outside the vestry door, and begged me one final time, I found I had already decided, weeks before, without quite admitting it to myself. That is the most frightening part of it, Miss Marple. I do not think I chose it that evening. I think I had chosen it already, and only pretended otherwise until the choosing was done. And the spectacles. I took the case without thinking, his cassock pocket, in the dark, in the confusion, because the photograph was folded inside it, and I could not risk anyone else finding it and asking why a picture of a strange young woman had been in the choir master's pocket the night he died. I burned it, that same night, in my own grate. I have wished every day since that I had not. It is the only likeness of her I will ever have, and I destroyed it with my own hands, out of the very fear that had already cost her a mother twice over. Miss Marple, listening, felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only the familiar, sorrowful weight that came, always, at the end of these conversations, the weight of understanding, entirely and completely, how an ordinary human fear, left to grow unchecked and unconfessed for a quarter of a century, could finally curdle into something as terrible as this. "Inspector Neil is waiting outside, my dear," she said at last, very gently. "I asked him to give us this hour because I thought you had rather earned the chance to tell it once, quietly, before it must be told a great many times over, to a great many less patient listeners. But it must be told to him now." Ottoline Grieve nodded and set down her teacup with a steadiness that seemed, in its own way, the last vestige of the composed and formidable woman the village had known for 26 years. "Yes," she said, "I think I am ready. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am glad it is finished. I have been so very tired, Miss Marple, of being the only one who knew." Chapter 15. What the village was told. Inspector Neil took his statement that same evening, quietly and without the fuss of handcuffs in the village street, for which small mercy the Reverend Pendle was, in the days that followed, privately and profoundly grateful. By the following morning the whole of Nettlecombe knew, in the way such things are always known, through Mrs. Latchford at the post office, through the baker's boy, through 100 small conversations over garden fences, that Ottoline Grieve had been taken into custody for the murder of Wilfred Coombs, and the reasons why were repeated, embroidered, and argued over with an appetite that struck Miss Marple as, in its way, rather sadder than the crime itself. "I never would have thought it," said Mrs. Latchford to Miss Marple, across the very same post office counter where she had once been so certain of Prudence Hale's guilt. "Not in 100 years. Mrs. Grieve, of all people. Why, she chaired the Garden Society for 15 years. People are very rarely what one has settled comfortably into believing them to be," said Miss Marple, buying her usual book of stamps. "I have found, over a good many years of observing my fellow creatures, that the persons one suspects least are very often carrying the heaviest weights of all, precisely because so much of their energy goes into appearing to carry nothing whatsoever. Colonel Bunting, when Miss Marple encountered him in the lane a few days later, admitted with rather more grace than she had expected that he had, for a wretched fortnight, half suspected Miss Hale himself, and was heartily ashamed of it now. Prudence Hale herself, meanwhile, had begun, tentatively, and at the vicar's gentle encouragement, to speak of writing at last to whatever remained of her sister's affairs in Canada, a small and private reckoning of her own, quite separate from the village's larger drama, that Miss Marple thought a good deal more important than anything said across the post office counter. And Mrs. Averill Sinclair, in Toronto, received in time a very careful letter from Mr. Fenwick's office, informing her gently of the whole sad history, including, at Miss Marple's own quiet suggestion, a description of the photograph her mother had kept, however briefly, however tragically, close enough to a dying man's heart to have caused, in the end, so very much grief. It was not, Miss Marple felt, quite the reunion the young woman had hoped for when she first wrote her hesitant letter to a choirmaster she had never met. But it was, perhaps, a kind of truth at last, and truth, however painful, generally did more good in the end than the comfortable silences that had preceded it. Chapter 16. The Bell Rings Again. The choir sang again at St. Fride's on the first Sunday of Advent, 6 weeks after Wilfred Coombes had folded sideways into the stall's mid-decant, and it was Prudence Hale, at the vicar's particular request, who took up the duties of choirmaster as well as organist, a double burden she accepted with a quiet steadiness that surprised nobody who had come, in the intervening weeks, to know her rather better than the village ever had before. Tilly Marsh sang the solo, her voice clear and true above the small congregation, and Miss Marple, sitting once again at the back of the church, thought that the child's shoulders this time carried nothing but the ordinary nervousness of any young soloist facing a listening crowd, the old unhappy tension gone, at last, now that the truth she had half glimpsed and been too frightened to speak had finally, properly, been told. Afterward, walking home in the early dusk of a December afternoon, Miss Marple found herself thinking, as she so often did at the close of these matters, not of the puzzle solved, but of the ordinary human frailty that had made the puzzle necessary in the first place. Ottoline Grieve had not been a wicked woman, not truly, only a frightened one, who had spent 26 years building a self she believed she could not survive losing, and had, in the moment that self seemed threatened, done something so far beyond the bounds of what she had ever imagined herself capable of that she herself had scarcely recognized her own hands doing it. "It is always the same story, really," Miss Marple murmured to herself, quite alone in the lane, her breath showing pale in the cold air, dressed up in different clothes each time. A person decides, very early, who they must be in order to be loved, and then spends the whole of their life more frightened of losing that decided self than of anything else in the world, including, in the end, their own conscience. I dare say it is not so very different from the fear that makes any of us tell small lies about ourselves at a tea party or a garden fete. It is only a matter of degree, and of how very much a person has already staked upon the lie being believed. She let herself in at her own gate, and paused a moment in the fog-softened dark to look back at the church, its windows glowing faintly gold with the last of the Advent candles, and thought that Wilfred Coombes, whatever his faults, and he had, she suspected, been rather too fond of managing other people's secrets for their own supposed good, had at least died believing he was offering a frightened woman one last, gentle chance at grace. That she had answered it with poison rather than courage was, in the end, the saddest part of the whole sad business. Sadder, Miss Marple thought, than the murder itself, which was, after all, only where the fear had finally led. She went inside, put the kettle on, and took up her knitting once more, the grey wool border nearly finished now, and thought that she would send it to Tilly Marsh in time for Christmas, with a note saying only that she hoped the child would sing again next year with a light heart, since some frights, once faced and spoken aloud, really did grow smaller with the telling, which was, Miss Marple reflected, watching the water come to the boil, very nearly the whole of what she had learned in a long life of noticing the small, ordinary things that other people so easily overlooked.